Hi there, Michael Deebs here, and welcome to the Benzo Rehab Projects Channel. Today I'd like to talk to you about step 1 of house renovations, which is coming into ownership of a house to renovate. Now, if you've watched the intro video to this channel or lived a day of your life in the world, you are already aware of some of the financial challenges facing all of us today. While I won't be getting into super specific details regarding my personal finances, which are modest anyways, what I will say about my financial situation is that I am lucky. Yes, it is true that I have worked very hard my entire life, and yes, it is true that I am good at what I do, and yes, it is true that I might even be what some could call smart. But there are lots of people who are incredibly hard workers that are good at what they do and who are smart folks who live paycheck to paycheck, because when the economic system we live in is working as intended, a large portion of the population must be continuously immiserated in order to maintain the individualized precarity that leads to a labor force without adequate bargaining power. We do not live in a meritocracy, and there are plenty of wealthy, lazy idiots and poor, hardworking geniuses. If you are struggling financially, it is important to remember that this is not so much of a personal failure as it is a system success, because we inhabit an unjust system. So I am lucky. I recognize that, and I recognize that compared to many folks, it is a position of privilege that I can even call myself a landowner today, even as humble as my property is, when so many people have so little and struggle to maintain access to shelter. But I am also certain that I am not the only person who has had the kind of luck I have had to be able to save up enough to buy a real beat-to-shit hovel like I have. And I think those of us who are lucky should act on our luck, get ourselves the financial security so that we can genuinely aid others, be it through providing shelter, or helping others into their own housing, or being a resource to the communities we belong to. A person who is drowning cannot help another drowning person. Only those who are on stable ground can be effective in rendering assistance. Excuse me, this is post-editing Deebs. I didn't feel like setting up my green screen just to record this little interjection, so you're getting a voiceover, and maybe I'll put a Sonic the Hedgehog gif in the background or something to keep you entertained. I sent a draft of this video around to a few people to critique it before I posted it, and one of the comments I got was on whether or not I was lucky to have worked hard and saved up to purchase a property, so I will expand on that here. I am lucky to have found financial security existing in an economic system that thrives on financial insecurity and is incentivized to grind people down to being financially hopeless. There is a passage I think fits well from W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Darkwater, which I was coincidentally reading during my trip to Virginia to check out the house after I had purchased it. He says, "My days of disillusion were not disappointing enough to discourage me. I was still upheld by that fund of infinite faith, although dimly about me I saw the shadow of disaster. I began to realize how much of what I had called will and ability was sheer luck. Suppose my good mother had preferred a steady income from my child labor rather than bank on the precarious dividend of my higher training. Suppose that pompous old village judge, whose dignity we often ruffled and whose apples we stole, had his way and sent me while a child to a reform school to learn a trade. Suppose Principal Hosmer had been born with no faith in darkies, and instead of giving me Greek and Latin, had taught me carpentry and the making of tin pans. Suppose I had missed a Harvard scholarship. Suppose the Slater Board had then, as now, distinct ideas as to where the education of Negroes should stop. Suppose and suppose. And I feel very much the same way in my own life. Suppose I had given in to my deep depression at a young age. Suppose I had been seriously wounded by the cops that harassed me during periods of homelessness in my youth. Suppose I was not able-bodied enough to join the military when I lost my job in the 2008 financial collapse. Suppose I did not get training in the technical field of electronics when I joined the military. Suppose I had been blown up in Afghanistan, and whether dead or permanently disabled was no longer capable of maintaining employment. Suppose and suppose. My life, as many others' lives, has been full of hardship, and I have certainly worked very hard and honestly to eke out what I have been able to achieve so far. but it is a point of survivorship bias to chalk the achievement up to anything other than sheer luck. What I would like is a world with luck being less crucial to a person's success, but I recognize where we are today. I hope that through this project, teaching skills in a hopefully entertaining and thoughtful way, I can, in some small way, contribute to the formation of that less luck-reliant world. With that, let's move to step 1 of buying a property. Step 1, figuring out where you want to live. There are a myriad of things to consider when purchasing a property, but as realtors always say, location, location, location. Where you want to live should factor in heavily when choosing a property. It is also going to have a massive impact on what you're paying for that property. As of writing and recording this, I currently live in Southern California, which has seen some of the steepest rises in housing costs in the country, and California in general has 2 cities in the list of the top 10 most expensive cities to live in, according to the World Economic Forum. So when it came to choosing a location, I had to kind of rule out a lot of California as an option because it was not financially viable. So the first thing to consider with location is that you are not in an episode of House Hunters. You are most likely not going to find anything affordable in or near any of the large metropolitan economic centers of the country, or the world for that matter. A real easy trick you can do is go on a real estate listing site like Zillow, remove all boundaries from your search and put a price filter on the results. You'll want to make sure you put a minimum price of a couple thousand or more dollars to filter out any of the $0 to low dollar listings placed to game the low to high price filter for clicks and engagement. Once you do this, you'll get a general sense based on your individual finances where you can afford to purchase a property. The second thing you'll want to consider with location is that state laws are getting pretty fucking weird right now. It seems like the US is going through a kind of soft to medium balkanization depending on where you live at, and individual rights are varying kind of wildly between states. Are you, for instance, a trans person who doesn't want to be persecuted by state overreach? Are you a woman who would like access to safe reproductive health care? At the end of a hard day's work or for treatment of a chronic illness, do you like to smoke a joint? Familiarize yourself with the laws of the areas you are considering to move to with your own personal lifestyle preferences and comfortability, including whether or not you're comfortable living at odds with the law. I'm not here to make your choices for you, and if you're happy where you are and it has properties you can afford, that's great. The third location thing to consider is going to be what services and what kinds of properties are available in the location you are moving to or currently living in. Keep in mind that rural does not always mean there aren't things like high-speed internet. Weirdly enough, moving from densely populated Southern California to a fairly rural area in Virginia, I'm actually going to improve my internet connection speeds by quite a lot. There are a variety of sites you can use to look up what kind of plans are in your area. Things like highspeedinternet.com or allconnect.com, and sometimes the official town or city websites will have links or information pertaining to local providers for essential services like internet, water, trash removal, etc. You'll also want to consider things like proximity to emergency and routine medical facilities, hardware stores for repair materials, or any other specialty shops pertaining to your hobbies and interests. In addition to the availability of things you need and like, what properties are available is equally important. Are you comfortable with a small plot of land, or are you like me and want a little bit of land to do stuff and things with? Some additional things you'll want to consider include, but are not limited to, the climate, the feasibility of wells. If you're planning on purchasing a property with an existing well, you'll want to know some basic information about the water table in the area to assess water reliability. Or if your property does not have a well and you would like it to, knowing the water table depth will let you ballpark the cost of drilling a well by seeking an estimate from a local well drilling company. Since wells are quite their own subject, maybe I'll cover that in a future video if it becomes applicable to my own or a friend's situation. The most important thing I can give you as advice as far as location is considered is that your first house is not going to be a dream home because we are not in an economically ideal situation. In making good out of this situation, we must stay with the trouble. We can't keep pining for things to change on their own. We can't ignore the problems we are facing, and ultimately we have to reimagine how we integrate with our environments to create a better, more livable situation for ourselves and others. This will likely mean lowering your expectations and committing to doing some hard work, and I think in order to think this through honestly, you have to consider, is owning a shitty house that you might have to put some work into worse or better than not owning a home and paying extortionist rates to live in an apartment that may decrease in quality or service, or that you can be removed from if you fall on hard times or the owner decides they'll take their chances, squeezing more money out of someone else. As far as I'm concerned, I'll live in a tent in my backyard if the house turns out to be a complete loss. There's lots of pretty impressive tents out there, and it beats paying some rent-seeking motherfucker for a roach-infested, understaffed, and under-maintained shithole. Step 2. Stuff's gonna cost ya. Alright, so you have a location in mind, or you at least know what parameters you should be looking for in choosing a location. Here's where we talk dollars and the buying process. Now, I have no experience buying a finance house, and I specifically chose not to finance a house because the economy is a fucking nightmare on a good day lately, and some of my formative years were spent watching people lose their houses to the banks that caused an economic crisis that led to massive job losses that led to people getting behind on their mortgage payments. So I can't give you a lot of advice on buying a financed home because usury is a sin and I do not associate with the ungodly. This advice is going to be for a home bought on a cash deal. There's not a lot of clearly laid out information on how a cash deal works, and as a first-time buyer, it caused me so much anxiety I barely slept for a whole month while the deal was awaiting finalization, so I'm going to give a clear breakdown on how the process goes. Step 1. You find a house you want to buy and make contact with the listing agent. I bought my house technically sight unseen, but I had the realtor do a video call with me and walk through the house, and I kind of asked him to look at specific details of the house closer if I needed a clearer picture of something that caught my attention or caused me some concern. If you are not as familiar with building repair as I am, you may want to do this step in person if at all possible to get a good understanding of what you are getting yourself involved with. As I tell everyone, when it comes to building repair, your gut is usually pretty good at letting you know whether something is wrong or needs to be redone. As an additional note, there are a lot of scams right now, so you should try to go through more official channels, sites like Zillow, Realtor.com, or the official websites of real estate agencies. In addition, before making contact with anyone, you should verify the existence of the listing agent and their real estate office. This will at the very least give you peace of mind and should keep you safe from scam artists. A simple Google search and looking at the realtor's office website, the property lawyer's website, verifying their physical address, and even using Google Street View to make sure that they're legit and exist in the real world are all things that I did at this point to verify. Step 2, I made an offer on the house. The listing agent then drew up the paperwork for the offer. The property owner counteroffered for a little bit more money than my offer, probably just to make themselves feel better because the property had a significant drop in the original listing price, and also I had lowballed them from that lower amount a bit because this was around the time that the house buying craze had slowed and I had better grounds to negotiate on. Another thing that happened at this point was that I had to verify I had access to enough funds to cover the cost of the price I was offering to buy the house at. After I agreed to the counteroffer, we entered into what is called a purchasing agreement. This is where things become more or less legally binding, and upon both parties signing this document is when I had to put forward what is called earnest money. Earnest money is essentially a deposit put forth by the buyer to show earnest intent to buy the property and is forfeit if the buyer decides to back out of the deal. If the seller decides to back out of the deal, the earnest money is refunded to the buyer. This purchase agreement also put a closing date into effect, which was a little over a month after the date of the purchase agreement. Step 4 was waiting for the property to close. This was honestly the most stressful part of the whole thing because it felt like I had something around 40 days of being in total limbo, not sure if the house would actually be mine, constantly checking in with the realtor, which I am sure annoyed him, but I don't fucking care, and basically just losing tons of sleep from anxiety. This was a huge contrast from the initial back and forth where I had to do a lot in a very short order of time to get the deal worked out, and for a not insignificant amount of time during this process, I wondered if I had been taken for a ride because I didn't really have to do anything until the house closed. And step number 5 was closing. Upon closing, the property lawyers got all the finalized documents together, and then I had to wire the money into their trust so that they could hold it while they waited for the property seller to send over their signed documents. This was the cherry on top of the sundae of stress. The amount of money I had to wire meant I had to go into the bank, and even though I had done a lot of verification that the realtor, the property lawyers, and the property itself was in fact a valid listing, I still shook a bit while the bank warned me repeatedly that there were a lot of property scams going on and that they could do nothing if I had wired my money to a Spanish prisoner, a Nigerian prince, or some other kind of advanced fee scam. Because the property owner was just a bullshit land holding LLC, and the purchase of the property is probably on the low end of transactions they usually handle, the owner apparently didn't feel it necessary to be on time for closing, and they got the closing documents to the property lawyers about a week late. And during that entire time, I had moved from harassing the realtor for updates to harassing the property lawyers for updates. Part of me felt bad for this, but then I realized that all these people probably did not have me as a high priority due to the smaller amount of money my purchase would earn all of them, so fuck them. If the same thing happens to you, definitely keep asking for updates, don't let them forget about you, and if closing gets delayed too far, you do have some legal options available to you to force the deal through. After all, you both signed a contract for the purchase, and it could be argued that delaying the purchase process devalues your investment through lapses in upkeep, market changes, or etc. If you need a real-world example of this, just look at how delaying the purchase of Twitter worked out for Elon Musk after he had signed a purchase agreement for it. So anyways, that was it. I was, and still am, the owner of this property now. I am going to keep the cost of my house intentionally vague, but my house on about an acre of land costs somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000, including all legal and service fees associated with transferring the title and the transfer tax. So you'll want to look up what fees apply to the state you are moving to. In Virginia, the title transfer tax is about $3.50 per every $1,000 of the purchase total, which in my case works out to about $140 for a $40,000 purchase. Not bad at all. You'll also want to look up things like the average property taxes in the area. I won't go into specifics, but for the property I have, the yearly property taxes amount to less than $600. That's it. Think of how much money you spend to live in an apartment. I'd bet for a lot of you that $600 is less than your monthly rent. For me, it is about 1/3 of my monthly rent here in California, and that's technically all I need to pony up to make sure that the property remains mine for an entire year. Just thinking about that is mind-blowing to me because it represents a massive financial burden being lifted off of me. $600 is only 120 hours at the dick-sucking factory. It's less than a single month's wages. You should also be sure to factor in some key additional costs. Depending on the kind of property you get and where it is, you'll need 1. Money saved up for moving. For instance, to move to my house in Virginia from California, I am looking at about $4,000 for a moving truck with a trailer for about a week of travel time. I also looked into whether or not I could use a moving service, but after giving my information to a few companies for quotes, these rat bastards will not stop calling me and texting me several times a day to ask about my move, despite telling them several times I am no longer interested. So on principle, I didn't even consider them an option after being continuously bothered by them. You'll also want money saved up to start renovations, varying depending on the condition of your property, of course. If you have a job in the area, you can probably afford less savings for this, but you'll want to have a few grand to throw around in order to get things moving on crucial repairs to any of the critical elements of your house. Things like roofing, plumbing, electrical, etc. You'll also want money to initiate services, sewage, electric, and internet. You can easily look up what service providers are in your area as mentioned previously by using the town, city, or county's official websites or using specialized search engines like highspeedinternet.com or allconnect.com, or just Googling the town name followed by trash service or water service. And finally, in my case, the purchase of the house kind of sent me back to being broke. House poor. But in order to bridge the gap between then and now, I took out a personal loan of a couple $1,000s to make sure I kept on top of my current financial obligations and to give myself some wiggle room for all the aforementioned costs. This is something you may want to consider, and even if you are not financing your house, you'll want to make sure you are aware of your credit score. Maybe try to do what you can to improve it before you make a purchase so that you have this kind of option available to you in case you need to finance any of your repairs. Since taking out that loan, because I'm lucky to be financially comfortable, I've been able to save up quite a bit more to where I feel pretty confident I can do the move, start some repairs, and have ample cushion for the financial pushing while I search for a job in the area. That's right, I do not have a job in the area. That'll probably work itself out, right? Anyways, that's the process and my advice so far on buying a house. May do a part 2, that's how I wrote it, sometime down the line on this if I find that after reflecting on my purchase and dealing with repairs, I have some more insights to give. As always, we love you, please take your medicine.